Our sponsor today is GLSA. For those non-members who may be dropping in on the call today, GLSA, or Group Legal Services Association, is an affiliate of the American Bar, and it is a professional membership representing the legal services plan industry and provider attorneys. And joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Check us out at glsaonline.org. Okay, my name is Tom Martin. I'll be your host today. Our teleconference today is Protecting Your Cloud Office. We are here to break down some of the concepts and actionable steps that you can take to secure your practice in the cloud. To help us today is our guest, Stephen Zetzer. Stephen is the founder and principal owner of eWranglers, and he founded it in January 2000 as a firm focused on information security needs of small businesses with clients in Montana and Colorado. He's a graduate of Indiana University Kelley School of Business, and he also holds a certified information system security professional credential. We're very lucky to have him here today, and it's a pleasure to have you on the show, Stephen. How's it going today in Denver?
It's going great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I was just saying how I appreciate the winter climate in Denver for being mild. You know, sometimes people think of Colorado as being snowbound, but Denver and its proximity and elevation is quite mild in the winter. So I'm enjoying that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's not what I expected to hear, but that's good. So let's see. Today we're talking about the Office Cloud, and I think the first question I have to ask you, just to get started so we're all on the same page, what is the Office Cloud?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. And you know, there's such a buzz about cloud computing now, and you know, even Amazon is touting AWS commercials during football games and such. So it has become very mainstream at this point. But really, if you just think about how a typical small firm has operated in the past, so for example, a firm with even 3 or 4 people in the past that used any type of legal management software system typically had to have a server, or they would just take one of the PCs in their office to designate as a place that served as the storage for all of the data that was related to the application. So things like PC law or other time slips. Professional was an older one. Those applications typically required a server or a PC in the office where the data was hosted. When we bring in the concept of cloud, it just basically moves the location where the data for your firm lives. So current applications are more, or current popular applications like Clio or something like that, they store the firm's data in a data center, a professionally operated data center that may be in a city far away from you. In most cases, these data centers are in the U.S., but you know, they may not be. So instead of having the data reside on that PC in your, or server in your physical office, now it resides offsite, and that's the main answer to that question. There's a lot more specifics that we'll get into here, but does that help shine some light on that?
It does. Well, but before we jump ahead, let me just ask you this, which I guess it's kind of the thing nowadays that people put that information in the cloud. But if we take a step back from it, for those that are still using a server in their office, why would I want to move it to the cloud? Like, what's the advantage of that? Because it seems to me, as a lawyer, we have you know, ethical obligations about how we handle our data, and that if we have it on site, on a rack in the closet, with our own administrator, that we have more control. So how how is it an advantage to have it in the cloud?
Well, I'll just use an analogy here. So think about electricity. So the way that you get electricity in your office or in your home is you plug into a wall jack, and the electricity is generated somewhere far away and is transmitted to you, and you really have no concern or care as to how the electricity is generated. Now, granted, yeah, you might have some environmental concerns and say, well, I want my electricity to come from renewable sources, but that's a tangent from that. The bottom line is that you plug into the wall and you get your electricity. So in the early days, when electricity was just becoming a thing and being available for commercial manufacturing operations and that type of thing, everyone had to generate their own electricity on site. They needed something like a mechanical paddle wheel. They needed some type of generation device, uh, and uh, and people would go through very elaborate schemes to generate their electricity that they needed to run their businesses. Uh, uh, Obviously, they would have to dedicate people and extensive resources to this. And if you think about the IT, the employment or the use of IT in business on a long-term time perspective is relatively new. And so that's kind of where we've been, is that in order to have these IT services available, like practice management system, practices have had to basically take um, the task into their own hands and operate a server in their office. And obviously, this has nothing to do with their business. And typically, there is no technical expertise to operate the server, and they need to hire it out. Maintenance can be complicated and expensive. You may not be able to find reliable help. Uh, One thing about the IT support industry, and especially IT support that caters to small businesses, there isn't any baseline regulation or requirement on skills or training. So you could end up with somebody supporting the server that's in your office who really has no formal training in information technology, and they may just be a hobbyist for that matter. So uh, practices that have used servers in their office have had very wide ranges of results. Some have had big disasters, some have had big success, but it's all over the board. So one advantage that you get in having your IT infrastructure hosted in the cloud is that the need to physically maintain that equipment usually shifts, or in the process of moving to the cloud, shifts to the cloud hosting provider. So now the cloud hosting provider becomes responsible for managing the hardware, the servers, um, the backups, those types of things that the practice would have been responsible for with an on-premise IT. Now they can just like essentially plug their computer in or connect their computer to Wi-Fi, just like plugging into the wall to get electricity. Now they're just connecting to the network, and that's all they need to be able to access their services. They don't have to be concerned with how those applications are being delivered.
And I assume you could save a lot of money doing it that way too, right?
You can. Uh, the results will vary, and it really depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. So some of the early on, well, there's a couple of models actually on how you can have your applications operated in the cloud. So and I'll classify it into two buckets. One bucket would be what I would call full cloud, and another bucket would be something that I might call hybrid cloud. And it really comes down to the level of I would call vertical integration that the cloud service provider or application provider has. And an example of a full cloud product might be an application that is 100% web based. So, what I mean by that is the way that you access the application is that you launch a web browser, typically any web browser. So it could be Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, Internet Explorer. It doesn't really matter. And all you have to do to access the full functionality of the applications is to log into a website. And on the back end, now your application provider, your cloud hosting provider, is taking care of all the details that are behind that website. So where the data is stored, all of the software development, all the backups, all that. And it's all essentially on one vendor. Now, in a hybrid environment, it might be an application that that is designed to run on a server. And so, same difference there. There's still a software provider that creates an application, and they say, well, it needs to run on a Windows X server. And now, in this hybrid environment, you contract with somebody like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure to actually operate a server on your behalf. And that environment tends to be a little bit more expensive in that now you have to buy the software and support from your vendor, and then you have to get somebody else, and it could be an IT consultant or a cloud provider like AWS or Microsoft Azure, to actually build a server on your behalf. So instead of having the server in your office, now the server lives at AWS or Microsoft Azure, and you pay a monthly fee for that. So you're paying for your software, your support for your software, and then you're paying hosting fees and licensing fees to your cloud provider. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you breaking it down. I love the analogy to that you had earlier to basically making your own power, like the electricity analogy, because having every office like creating their own power supply, or in this case, creating their own, server in their own office, it made me think of Gilligan's Island, where Doc is on his exercise bike creating electricity, and you surely don't want that in each and every law office. You wanna you wanna farm that out to the professionals. So makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a distraction, really, because your main business is practicing law, and if you're spending half your day, on the phone with IT people, or carving out a percentage of your square footage in your office to house the server, bringing data lines into your office, or here's another advantage of being in the cloud. If you have more than one office, or if you like to work from home, or from court or from client sites, if the server in the application was in your physical office, then you had to technically find some way to make a connection back to your office to get to your data. And those are typically done with virtual private networks, and they can be difficult to support, and difficult to set up. So that's another distraction. Whereas once your application is hosted by a cloud provider, or like at Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, you typically have the ability to connect from anywhere now, and that's out of the box. So that's a huge benefit and that's a big driver of cloud applications.
So how did we get here to the cloud? I think you wanted to talk a little bit about the background of it.
Yeah, and so obviously the old method had a lot of shortcomings. So one of them was that people had to acquire or hire some technical expertise to maintain a server in their office. And they had obviously the challenges of remote access. They had challenges of backup and disaster recovery. I mean, you hear stories all the time where someone had a ransomware and came and encrypted all the files on their server, and then they called their IT provider and said, well, can we restore from backup? And they say, well, the backup actually hasn't worked for the last 6 months. We did set it up, but it stopped working and nobody knew it. And the best thing we could do is get your data from 6 months ago. So obviously there were some major problems and frustrations for people to be using IT, especially for very small firms. It just was a burden, and a lot of firms even stayed away from getting the full benefits of some IT applications just because they simply didn't have the expertise or didn't have the stomach to take the risk to spend the money to do all that. So as technology improved, and it's really the quality and speed of internet connections that has enabled these applications now to live far away in these data centers. Wi-Fi is pretty much ubiquitous. Pretty much everyone has Wi-Fi in their home. You can pretty much get Wi-Fi anywhere you go. You can use your phone as a Wi-Fi hotspot. And any office is more likely to have an internet connection than they are to actually have a landline phone to this day. And so many applications that are so advanced have become available through these cloud providers. So you're looking at practice management, billing, human resources, chatbots, phone systems, essentially any key business function can be hosted in the cloud. And I'll give an example for a phone system. In the old days, again, you would, if you needed a phone system that had multiple telephones with extensions in your office, you would buy a box that would physically live in your office. And so if you had a second office or you're working from home, you essentially have to use a home phone or a cell phone to dial, and you can't be part of the office. Whereas with modern phone systems, now you have a cloud-hosted phone system. Your phone can be an app on your cell phone. It can be an app on your computer. It can be a physical desk phone. But the bottom line is that only has to be plugged in to an internet connection, and it can be plugged in anywhere. It can connect to a data center. And so you could be working from down on the beach in Cancun, and you actually are accessible via your regular office extension number 105. So somebody calls into the main number, your receptionist says, "Oh, let me transfer you to the attorney," and transfers to extension 105. You pick up, and as far as the caller is concerned, you're in the office. So all of these powerful applications have been really the big driver that people have been able to do so much more when the applications are hosted in the cloud.
So how do we protect it? How do we protect our data, our clients when we use the cloud? How do we make that happen?
Well, I'll say that that's a really good question. The bottom line is the protection that you afford to the cloud environment is the same that you would afford to an on-premise environment. And you want to protect data when it's in transit or at rest. And you want to consider all of the scenarios where the data goes. And so now
let me stop you there for a second. Sorry, but when you say protect data at rest and in transit, what does that mean?
So all of the data that has to do with your practice, whether it be a document that you've created, whether it be an email message, whether it be a record that is in your practice management system, it all lives somewhere where its resting place is. So when I say at rest, that would be the device or the server where that particular stuff lives. Now, what happens in a cloud environment is there may be copies of these files that will end up in all kinds of places on all kinds of devices, and you, in your strategy, you really need to be aware of where all the data would likely end up. So I'll give an example of a cloud application like Dropbox. Cloud file storage has become a huge application, and most small firms that I talk to are using some form of cloud file storage. So if you use Dropbox, Dropbox has the ability to synchronize copies of files among multiple devices. And so any device that has the Dropbox app installed on it potentially has a copy of all the files. So now you've got data at rest on a laptop computer, potentially on a cell phone, potentially on another home computer, multiple computers. So this is the real consideration that you need to have, that, hey, where are all the places where my data can end up? And how can I make sure that wherever the data does end up, it still has the same level of protection that it would have if it was simply contained in my physical office in the old days.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to keep it simple, right? You're a small firm. Don't overthink this. Just create, and I can make available some sample policies via a link on the podcast here. But 1 or 2 pages of do's and don'ts in your office, and say, hey, in our office we're using Dropbox to store files, for example. These are the boundaries as to what devices are acceptable to connect to Dropbox. If the device connects to Dropbox, you need to have these particular security parameters. So it kind of flows downhill. So I'll break down an example with a cell phone, for example. You can use the Dropbox app to view your Dropbox files on your phone, which is awesome. So let's say you're in court, you say, I need to look at that document. Boom, you can jump into your Dropbox app and view that file. Now, obviously, you do not want that phone to get in the hands of a third party, someone who's not authorized to see that data. So there's 2 simple things to do to protect the phone, and these are 2 things that you would put on your Office procedure document, and you would say, hey, if the phone is going to connect to Dropbox or to the Office email system for that matter, the phone needs to have a passcode on it. And number 2, the vendor account that is used to register that phone, and in the case of an iPhone, it would be the Apple ID, or an Android phone, it would be the Google account. You'd want to have 2-factor authentication set up on the Apple ID or the Google account that's related to that phone. And those 2 measures are very simple things that you can do, but they go a long way towards protecting any data that ends up being, essentially cached or stored at rest on that particular device. And the same thing applies to a laptop.
What is 2-factor authentication, and how would that help?
It's a good question. One of the big risks with a cloud application is that, essentially you've got a whole world of information simply behind a web page, a user ID, and a password. And we know that a lot of people will tend to use simpler passwords that are easier to remember, and also they may use passwords in more than one site. So passwords alone are not considered super secure. And when you consider that, hey, all of the data about your practice, all of your emails, all of your cases, all of your documents, everything lives in some cloud service. If it's only sitting behind a user ID and a password, you know, in my opinion, that's negligent. That's being that is being negligent with the data. And so you need to take an extra level of security to protect that data. And most of the cloud providers will do a function they call two-factor authentication, where after you put in your username and your password, then they will send you a text message, or you'll use some kind of app that will generate a one-time code that's valid for about 60 seconds. And that code will then be required to complete the login. And that provides the extra level of protection that you need, given the sensitivity of the data that's up in the cloud. I also have a podcast, and I did do a whole episode about two-factor authentication, and I can provide a link to my podcast on the resources for this.
That'll be great. So let's talk a little bit more about what the steps we could take to protect our information in the cloud. You had mentioned that, you know, if it's just a username and password, then it might be easy for somebody to crack it. Then if we have two-factor authentication, at least we have some physical thing that needs to be brought into the loop, like our phone that gets texted a code or something like that. How do we come up with better passwords? Like, is there an easier way of handling that? Because that's I could tell you from my own experience, trying to remember passwords on a whole bunch of different websites is I forget a lot of times and have to reset my passwords because I've forgotten them. Is there a better way to manage that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're really reaching critical mass with passwords, and you know, a typical person will have anywhere from 20 to 50 or more username and password combinations that they will regularly need to just get through their day. And there are applications that help manage passwords. And I'll put out the example of like LastPass, KeePass. A lot of the operating systems and browsers now are integrating password management into their particular functofunctionality. And again, you can end up with data all over the place, and it's tough there. So I do recommend using a professional password application. I personally recommend LastPass Enterprise, and the reason I do this is that even if you've got just one or two other people working in your office, you are able to create folders in LastPass, for example, that you could share with your administrator. And so there are some passwords that would be relevant for for multiple people who work in the office. And also, you don't want people who work for you to end up with an island of knowledge that might go if they no longer work for you or something happens to them. By using something like LastPass, you're able to maintain continuity with that stuff. But what LastPass will give you is the ability to now use unique passwords for every application. Since you don't have to remember them, typically the password will be entered automatically when you go to a website, or you could just copy and paste it from within the app. And so then you can use much more complex passwords, 16 characters for a common password that are randomly generated, much stronger than you could do on your own. I do predict there's going to be a big shakeout coming in the password management application space, simply because so many parties are introducing this functionality. So, Apple's gotten much more aggressive in its managing of passwords automatically on an iPhone platform, for example, and then those passwords are available if you work on a Mac. So the long answer, right? Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. And so what are other ways that we can work to make things more secure?
So you really have to really know that ultimately the accountability for the data security does rest with you. So as easy as it might be to say, oh, well, I just have this cloud application and it's all on the vendor now. I don't have to care. Again, as we've been going through, there are things that you should be doing to make sure that you are still using your data in a responsible way. So yes, you can cede responsibility of the physical server, because the physical server now lives in a data center that the vendor that you're using to host for you is responsible for. A lot of the vendors will have a wide range of security practices. There are some professional standards for data center operations, for data center security, and by going with some of the larger established providers like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, or an application that is completely hosted by the vendor, you are in pretty good shape. But it's a good idea to know what the security practices are of the vendor, and a lot of vendors will publish their security practices, and some of them will write it into your user agreement. But again, it really comes down to, in your office, having that document that says what is acceptable to do in your office. So if you've decided that Dropbox is your file sharing application, for example, just having a few bullet points about, hey, all of the files related to business in the office are to be stored in your Dropbox account, which you are being given a Dropbox account as part of your employment. And the structure is this. So if the files are related to a case, we file them this way. If the files are related to something else, we file them this way. If the files are related to a case and we have a practice management system, then we may decide that in the office we're keeping the files in there. But just having that document and saying how you do it in your office, and that general rank and file employees are not permitted, for example, to connect their personal cell phone to the business email account or to the Dropbox account. You can decide either way, but the key is to just decide and document it. And if you decide, oh, no, employees are allowed to use their personal cell phone, and they can use it, but they need to put these particular measures in place. Number one, having that passcode on the device. Number two, protecting the vendor registration of the device with Google or with Apple, that you've got two-factor authentication on that account. So, a couple other ways you need to consider would be how you share data with other parties, right? So a lot of people rely on email, not so much anymore on faxes, but so much is emailed. And what a lot of people don't understand is that email, when it's traveling from you to its destination, could be intercepted. And as that email is traveling, it's like a postcard. So if you think of what you're putting in an email when you send it, if it's something that you would not write on a postcard that goes open through the mail and readable by anybody who touches it in the process of delivery, then generally you shouldn't put that in what's called a regular plain text email. You do want the ability to send secure emails And that's a huge consideration. And I recommend that you write that into your policy and say that, hey, if your email contains any client attorney privileged information, any personally identifiable information, social security numbers, medical records, any of that type of stuff, those messages should be secured. And you do need to have the ability to do that. So that's definitely a key feature to have. It's go ahead.
Yeah, one question I have, I've always been curious about this, is that I know that, that standard email is not secured and that, like you said, think of it as a postcard. But how does a hacker um, read it? How do they catch it in the stream of everything that's moving through the internet and be able to grab it in a sense, turn that card over and read it? How do they do that?
Yeah, so very sophisticated hacking is happening all the time.
Mhm.
A lot of hackers don't even care about what the content of any information that they're able to harvest is. They simply collect it and post it for sale. And so there may be nation state actors, there may be just organized crime or individuals who are profit motivated, but they will hack the the waypoints that the email has to pass through on its destination, and they will monitor the traffic that is on these endpoints. So you may have heard about some of the controversy with Huawei and some of the telecommunications equipment they provide. There was a lot of concern that those pieces of equipment had software or hardware built into them where they would actually send a copy of all the data passing through them to the Chinese government.
Oh,
And,
wow.
it's maybe a conspiracy theory or whatever, but the concern was that, hey, we don't know what is in the underlying electronics of these devices. And the company has become so huge and their products quite ubiquitous that it definitely gave pause to the U.S. National Security Agency, and they said, hey, you might, and ZTE, the other big Chinese company, they said if your data passes through some of this equipment on the path to its endpoint, it may be subject to compromise. And so that comes back to sending a secure email. When your email is encrypted, when it passes through those waypoints, it's not able to be read because it's encrypted with very, very strong data scrambling. So you assume that your data, and this is where I talk about data in transit, that it's going to be subject to eavesdropping at some waypoint that it has to pass through to reach its destination. And your responsibility is to transmit the data in a way that you know that it's never going to be unencrypted until it is in front of the eyes of the intended recipient. And that's not very hard to do when you have a professionally configured email system like Microsoft Office 365. You can add on a encryption feature that automatically encrypts mails that contain information, or you can use a keyword. I like to use a keyword where the email needs to be secured, and you can put the keyword in the subject line. And as that message goes out, it'll be picked up and encrypted.
Wow. It's literally like modern day highway robbery where it used to be back in old England that there would be robbers waiting in the highway where people had to transport stuff from here to there, but now on the internet.
Yeah, now they basically are just sitting there with a vacuum cleaner and vacuuming up a copy of everything that passes by on the highway. And
Wow.
then they make a copy and they say, oh, look, this is usable. Somebody's going to want this. Here's some information on a political candidate that they were communicating with their attorney about some private matter. And yeah, this is going to be very useful.
Okay. Well, I know that there's a ton to talk about. Are there any I mean, there's just a vast universe of security measures I'm sure that could be taken for cloud computing. Are there any last pointers that you would have for our listeners?
Well, I will say that ultimately, given all the concerns about cloud computing security and essentially losing control of your data, that if you're diligent to take some of the simple steps that I've gone through in the course of this podcast, that if you're hosting all of the applications for your practice in the cloud, that you actually could be more secure than you were when things were hosted on a server in your office. And uh, and 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 I would say that you are safe using cloud applications in a mindful way, as I've outlined in the podcast here, for everything that you do in your practice.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I love learning more about how we can protect our office in the cloud. I think you've provided some really great insight and pointers here about how the cloud works, how to keep our firm and our client information safe. So I want to thank you again for sharing your time and your thoughts today. How can people keep in touch with you?
Well, you can certainly go to my website, which is ewranglersbts.com, ewranglersbts.com. You can reach me on LinkedIn, Stephen Zetzer on LinkedIn. My office phone number, 888-908-4551, if you'd like to call directly. And we will place some links on the recording for this podcast as well.
Yeah, definitely. When we post this on the GLSA website, we'll include some links to some more helpful information from Stephen. And thank you, Stephen, again for being my guest today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor.
And thank you all for attending our teleconference, Protecting Your Cloud Office with Stephen Zetzer. Again, my name is Tom Martin. I want to thank you and thank GLSA for sponsoring. Remember, joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. You can check us out at glsaonline.org. Well, I'll see you next month. And in the meantime, to everyone, happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.